Harry Belafonte. Just the name itself brings forth powerful memories of the star singer, actor, producer, humanitarian, and close-up witness and participant in the civil rights struggles of the last half of the 20th century. His life, public and private, is revealed with unflinching honesty in his book, My Song, a Memoir, and in this interview with me in his New York City office. Well, first off, Harry Belafonte, so glad to sit before you and to join us here on TV One.
It's good to see you again.
I read your book, My Song, a Memoir. And what was really interesting is when you talked about why you needed to do this book, why you needed to do the HBO documentary. Because with Marlon Brando, your longtime friend, passing away, all of that history died with him.
Yes, there's a whole culture in America that's deeply committed to the politics of progress. And a lot of people play a role in that culture, but they play it quietly. And a lot of them have celebrity status. And Marlon and I grew up together. I met him when I was 19. We were in school together. And our careers our lives paralleled one another. As a matter of fact, he introduced me to my second wife. And
someone who he was dating.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I met her while he was dating her. And I said, "This is too good for you, Marlon."
That's a good friend.
Anyway, he did a lot. He did a lot with the Black Panthers. He did a lot with SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He came and met with Dr. King any number of times, came to New York, along with a host of other celebrities, to raise funds and to raise consciousness. I think America needs to know that they have citizens who do this on a much larger scale than the press is able to report or chooses to report. So when he passed, I saw the void that was there as far as my soul was concerned, because I lost a very good friend. But then I understood that he went away without ever telling America what he did. And America needed to know that there are a lot of citizens that make a difference. So I decided that I would go out and find people who knew him, knew the history, and could comment on it. And as I started on that path, I ran into a lot of other people that had parallel histories to Marlon, and I thought they should be in this story that I was attempting to tell. And as a consequence, we came up with Sing Your Song. When I got through making the film, I realized that we had about close to 800 hours of interview footage. And we only had an hour and 40 minutes in which to tell the story. So the idea of a book, to become more subtextual, to talk more deeply about the context of the history of the period, was required. So then I went off and started to do the book at a parallel time that we were editing, as we were editing the film. And both came out at the same time.
I've always been fascinated with history, but specifically African American history. When Gordon Parks died, when I read these obits, and you're sitting here saying, man, he did all of this. And I began to get DVDs and begin to get books to really understand who he was. And in many ways, that's how I felt reading this book. I mean, I'm sitting there going, man, I've known a lot of stuff, about Harry Belafonte. But wow, this is amazing. And what really stood out was that you literally were at the intersection of so much history. Paul Robeson, W.B. Du Bois going to dinner, Dr. King going through SNCC and all of those folks. And so when you think back on that, do you even tell yourself, man, those were amazing times?
I really didn't get into the fact, I knew there were amazing times as I was living out the history. You can't have over 250,000 people show up in the Mall of Washington, D.C. and don't know that something's going on.
Right.
So things like that, which were outstanding, obviously stood out. And I was aware of the fact that I was with men like Dr. King and John Kennedy and Nelson Mandela, and women like Eleanor Roosevelt and Rosa Parks, who had their hands on the pulse of our time, and that to be in their service meant that I was doing something that had historical value. It is in that spirit that I was able to sustain and maintain a life of social commitment that satisfied the earliest instructions that I got from my mother, which was never go to bed at night knowing that there was something you could do to stop injustice and didn't commit yourself to it. She said, make sure you always wake up every day doing something to help enhance justice. And with that instruction, which I got quite young, it just stayed with me all my life and became the thing that I measured most of what I did my life against.
Next, Harry Belafonte's mother may have directed him towards a life of service, but life with her was difficult and damaging.
Life with my mother was not easy. I didn't really come to understand her more fully until I'd gone through a whole period of psychoanalysis and began to look back into my life in greater detail to understand what were the things that really, what were her obstacles, what were the things that she had to overcome, and what price did we pay in her attempt to overcome these hurdles. You talk about your mother, and that was just a consistent theme from beginning to end. Not only the lessons she taught, but also this struggle between the both of you and this dynamic. Was it painful for you to have to relive that? If I had attempted to tell this story some 20 years earlier, I would have found the details of it somewhat painful, visibly so. But by the time I told the story, I had long since sorted out a lot of the pain, a lot of the problems. Life with my mother was not easy. I didn't really come to understand her more fully until I'd gone through a whole period of psychoanalysis and began to look back into my life in greater detail to understand what were the things that really, what were her obstacles, what were the things that she had to overcome, and what price did we pay in her attempt to overcome these hurdles and these obstacles that were put before her. So when I told the story, I could do it with some sense of ease and with some sense of calm. But it has never been easy to talk about my mother. I didn't know when she passed away. When we finally found her, she was in a pauper's grave. We had to retrieve her body to identify her and put her in a place of rest that was more appropriate. But she made life very challenging. None of us seemed to have been able to do anything that pleased her. She was in such a pained place as a woman, as an immigrant, and as a person of color. Now, here's what I found to be interesting. You talk about that pain and her being sort of locked in, and then you doing psychoanalysis. And Terry Williams, in her book Black Pain, she talks about the importance of African Americans not being afraid to go to therapy. I think there's a particular stamp on the life of black people where they're afraid to expose their deepest feelings, because in those feelings resides a rage that's almost nuclear in its proportions to reality. Black people have always kept their pain in a silent place. On occasion, it erupts, and when it erupts, it usually erupts violently. I think most of our culture, most of our lives are spent trying to contain that anger and to try to deal with life in some rational and productive way. It's not easy. And especially when it comes to talking about things that my particular brand of analysis came through the Freudian experience. And in order to understand a lot about your life, there is an aspect of the analytic application where you have to dig deep into your sexuality, into the conflicts of sexuality. And in the black community, we're overburdened with a lot of things that have to do with homophobia. with how we look upon others who may see life sexually different than we do. In my family, for instance, I had an uncle, the youngest of my family, who was gay. And I had another uncle who was stone gangster. He ran the numbers business in Harlem, highly regarded in that culture. His name was Lenny Love. He knew Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy Johnson was one of his agents in the street, one of his runners. And he was this macho guy. And every time we had a family dinner and my gay uncle showed up, my uncle Lenny went into an epileptic moment. He just kind of always choked on the fact that this person sitting across him had effeminate ways, had a style to his life, and had a humor that just didn't fit what he thought a real man should look like.
And then what we also have is that whole notion of what constitutes a real man is I have multiple ladies, so therefore multiple children, so therefore so my manhood is defined by that.
Yes, absolutely. That's all part of the game. So when I came upon the whole issue of analysis, I wasn't so much looking at how to identify my sexuality. I was looking at how to contain it and how to get away from those things that you constantly substituted sex for when you really have been dealing with issues on another level. It was an important period for me.
So you get all of that in your history, all of that operating in your DNA, and it's a question of, okay, I need to figure out, how does this play a role in who I am?
I found that necessity was most critical when I was diagnosed almost at the age of 70 with cancer. I was stunned by the examination and the results that they found when they took sampling.
Is that because you were always healthy, you always took care of yourself and always fit?
Absolutely. I'm in a culture where, you know, I ride horses with Sidney Poitier and shoot bad guys. I mean, the life in which we live, you sometimes feel that you are impervious.
Right.
You know, that nothing can touch you. And when they told me that I had cancer, it absolutely stunned me. And I had to go through that whole thing of looking at why me and what was it about. I decided to become very active in doing consciousness raising around in the black community on the issues of cancer when I discovered that black men were more exposed to cancer than almost any other tribe, any other group. And in taking a look at why this was, there was an important critical part of that critique which said homophobia, men's unwillingness to be examined, to have rectal examination and other things.
I don't want anybody touching me. And then they bring up the Tuskegee experiment. They bring up every kind of excuse possible.
Exactly.
And you're sitting there going, yeah, but you know you could be dying.
Exactly. And I had to just get out and say to black men, went to churches, did a lot of stuff up at the Abyssinia Baptist and other churches around America, talking to the black male community, women as well. I didn't ignore the gender implications, but I went after men mostly because they were the ones that were the most affected numerically.
Because men are hard-headed.
Absolutely.
When we come back, Harry Belafonte on the civil rights leaders who profited from the movement.
I know a lot of leaders in the civil rights movement who became very powerful businessmen, who became very rich. A lot of the children of those men became people who just got to Wall Street and got to business, and that's all they did. They said, we don't need to do that, you all did that, it's another day. Well, the truth of the matter is that you do need to do that, and it's not another day, because as long as there's poverty, there's going to be struggle.
One of the points that you made in the book when you talked about that period in the 70s, really the late 60s, when SNCC began to become extremely radical. Black power, want whites out, forget what the civil rights movement was about. And you asked the question in your book, where is that next generation of leaders? The folks who followed in the footsteps of Dr. King, Abernathy, Andrew Young, Hosea Williams, Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer. And you made the point that they are more concerned about getting their own financial fruits as opposed to having that consciousness of the previous generation.
The present generation and a generation or two even before them really were hugely preoccupied with reaping the harvest of the struggle that those of us were engaged in trying to change the game. And in a way we were responsible because we wanted our kids to go to school, we wanted them to get degrees, we wanted to get into the mainstream.
And not to have to face adversity.
That's right. And not to have to face diversity. And a lot of them took the call because a lot of them did not want to face diversity. They went off and did things that were very self-serving about getting rich, having a position that gave them material power, material acquisition, and that became the game. And when I looked around at those of us who had been in the struggle, I noticed that in many instances, a lot of the very people who were at the apex of the revolution, of the struggle, soon became the very things they set out to defeat. I know a lot of leaders in the civil rights movement who became very powerful businessmen, who became very rich. A lot of the children of those men became people who just got to Wall Street and got to business, and that's all they did. They said, we don't need to do that, you all did that, it's another day. Well, the truth of the matter is that you do need to do that, and it's not another day, because as long as there's poverty, there's going to be struggle, and as long as struggle exists, somebody has to be there to help with that struggle overcome the tenets of poverty.
In your book, you also offered some advice to artists. And you talked about their responsibility and how they have the voice, the platform, to address these social, cultural issues. Assess this generation of artists, black or white, and are they as involved as you would want them to be on some of the critical issues facing this country and this world?
From my perspective, by no stretch of the imagination can I say that the cultural community, the arts community, is anywhere near a commitment to doing things about changing the pain that exists in a lot of different levels socially. My mentor, Paul Robeson, once said to me that it was a great adventure that I and others were embarking on. So when I was quite young, Ossie Davis and Ruby Dee and Sidney Poitier were all listening to our mentor speak when he came to see a play that we were doing. And he said, you know, artists are the gatekeepers of the truth, are the gatekeepers of truth. And it is through you that people are going to be instructed about not only where they came from, but where we should be going. And I think if you look at great art, if you look at art that is in the service of social need, you'll find that the greatness of literature, the greatness of the fine arts, painting, all those things came from men and women of consciousness who tried to better the plight of human beings. In that context, I've often looked upon the power that we have in what comes out of celebrity. When I first went to Japan to sing, and I found myself before 50,000 Japanese trying to sing the Banana Boat song, I really understood power. I said, my God, here I am in a strange place with a bunch of people that I didn't know anything about except adversarially because of the war. And I said, here they were singing my song. And what do you do with this platform besides harvest money? How do you use this platform to impart a sense of our common humanity? And I think art that does that has been art that serves us well. And in my generation, we had a large number of people who stepped to the plate, whether it was Bob Dylan and Joan Baez, or it was Richie Havens, or it was Josh White, or it was Leadbelly. I mean, a litany of people. Sidney Poitier, all the actors of the period that did what they did. It's always about moving the human family ahead. And I think that artists have that power, and they have the obligation to sending out information and to giving ideas and thoughts to people that will help enrich them, and get them out of the quagmire in which we find ourselves.
If we draw a line, we can draw a line from Robeson to Belafonte. Who do you connect or hand the baton to? Who can we draw that line with present day? Who is following in your tradition, who is following in Robeson's tradition?
I think there are a number of artists, not just in America, but in other places in the world. I've seen a lot of artists out of Africa that I admire greatly because they get that message. They are creatures of social thought. I find a lot of people who nobody's heard of that I find singing in the rap culture, and I find the rap culture the most problematic for me because I think there was a form, a cultural dynamic that took place that was rooted in social protest, that was rooted in the message. And the minute somebody came along with the jingle and they saw that they could wrap gold around their necks and that the culture could go someplace else, we lost our path.
So you saw that period where rap music was sort of like folk music, the music that you really got yourself wrapped into.
Rap
the songs
music
of the
is folk music.
Right.
Because like my friend Brian McGee would say, it has to be folk music because I never heard a horse sing. Folks sing. Folks
right.
tell this. And what I found with the young guys up in the Bronx, Melly Mel, Africa Bombada, et al., were guys that came in protest, and instead of taking a 44 and blowing your brains out and shooting one another, they decided to get together and challenge each other through a cultural dynamic. That was a very healthy step for young people to take. But the merchants saw an opportunity to exploit this for gain, for profit, and corrupted the process.
Up next, Harry Belafonte on the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the struggle for civil rights.
We never, ever lost the battle. I went back and took a look at the whole journey of the civil rights movement. We didn't win the war. We're still in the war. But we never lost a battle on the way.
You get a phone call one day, and you're told the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wants to talk with you. And you write that literally, the beginning of that relationship, literally changed your life. What was it about him that was so unique, that was so different, so transformative for you?
His humility. I was stunned by it. I was sitting in a room with a kid 24 years old when I first met him.
And in your book, there's a picture, and you're sitting there. You're only a few years older, but he looks so young sitting at that table.
But he was.
Right.
He was 24. And incidentally, I was 26.
Right, right.
The old man of the crowd. But here we were sitting in this room, and as he unfolded his mission to me, I could not only, I had to handle the fact that he came with an inordinate intelligence and the way in which he phrased the things he had to say and his vision for them constantly evoked in me a great sense of challenge and a great sense of need and desire.
Y'all was sitting there for 3 or 4 hours.
That's right. And that's where I wanted to be. So in that context, I saw in him the model. I was wide open to violence. I had come from it. I had lived in it all my life and quite prepared to apply it at any given moment if my turf was invaded.
And you had a lot of that anger bored up inside of you.
Yeah. The anger's still there, incidentally, because at Dr. King's instruction, he thought anger was a very, very important tool. He said, we first need to be angry at our plight before we will act upon changing our condition. So anger is a necessary force. It's not so much that you're angry, it's what you do with your anger that finally determines the importance of anger. And what I saw in him was a chance to use nonviolence as a weapon to change the conditions in which we lived. And as much as I would have liked to in the beginning poo-poo that idea, my first attraction to it was, I said, tactically speaking, that's not bad. Tactically speaking, you are somewhat disarmed. if when I give you love, you give me a slap in the face. Something is wrong with that equation. The onus is on us who are being attacked and those who are doing the attacking to change what they do.
I've long said that one of the most underappreciated aspects of Dr. King, the Civil Rights Movement, is that people don't appreciate the strategizing. That it wasn't just, let's go out and take a march. In your book, you really get into the strategy of what's next and how long it'll take and what's the next step and who do we call and who do we work with here and here to make these things a reality.
I think anybody who has the rebel spirit sees the mission in that context. Every time we won a campaign, and incidentally, I have to tell you, and I will be challenged by anybody who would like to challenge me, we never, ever lost a battle. I went back and took a look at the whole journey of the Civil Rights Movement. We didn't win the war. We're still in the war, but we never lost a battle on the way. So anybody who says, well, that was back then and that was when, I tell you that it's still applicable today. Because when I look at
Egypt and Tunisia.
But yeah, and I would look at Occupy Wall Street.
Yeah,
that's still us.
Well, I see. To me, that's the Poor People's Campaign.
That is the Poor People's Campaign, no question about it. And the fact that they have chosen to use nonviolence as the tactic by which to confront the oppressor is, to me, one of the cleverest of applications they could have picked, nonviolence. And in this context, I think what Dr. King gave us in this tool was something that I grew to believe in. I began to study nonviolence and its deeper tenets, and I think it's the best we could have.
You saw young people really as that driving force of the movement. Is part of the problem today there was not that mechanism that stayed in place that was driven and directed by young people to pass on from one generation to the next?
I have a conversation in the film with Mandela when I say to him, somewhere along the line, we who were engaged in the struggle dropped the baton. We did not pass it on to the next generation. And I was eager to hear his response and somewhat touched by the fact that he saw that aspect of our struggle in the same context. He said, yes, we failed. We did not do what we should do. But then when I went back and took a look at the charts of life, if you have never had the right to vote and did not even understand the process of voting, if all of a sudden you wake up one day and all of a sudden you can go into a voting booth and cast your vote for somebody, the first question you have as a black person coming to that booth is, who do I vote for and why? Mm-hmm. And when you're looking for who to vote for, you have to have somebody who counsels you, or you have a relationship to the community in which you live that tells you who's the most anointed. And I think every time black people went to vote, and a lot of poor people went to vote for the first time, what they found was that the people they could most trust were the people who were from the Civil Rights Movement. Mm-hmm. So along came Andy Young, who was required to get into the electoral process. Along came Julian Bond, who was required to get into the electoral process. Along came John Lewis, who was required to... So all these civil rights leaders that came from these communities flocked to fill the next space that we had opened up for ourselves. We had to have young, bright men and women sitting in places that could run the legislative branch of government, that could sit and write laws and become engaged. And once we got them into that position, we no longer had those people in the community servicing the growth and the counseling of young Turks coming up.
So the grassroots infrastructure became the political infrastructure.
Exactly.
And there no longer was a grassroots infrastructure there to support what they'd already done.
Exactly. We're just now getting back to that. And I think we're getting back to that in a very healthy way by what you see going on with Occupy Wall Street and going on in Oakland.
It was very interesting to read you talk about the toll your work in terms of singing and acting, but also your commitment to causes had on your marriages and your family. I'm reading a book on Ella Baker and how she essentially, when she got divorced, she married the movement. Explain for folks, and you talked about it in the book, Dr. King as well, explain for folks really what the price families have to pay for freedom fighters to do what they do.
I am constantly confronted with that thought. And it's in my own cultural, my own historic DNA. There's no way to serve the cause of my son says it very succinctly in the film. He said, we had a problem. He said, we had the family of man, and Dad had his own family. And he was running between the two like a lunatic. That's exactly what he said. I had to laugh because I had this vision from his perspective as a kid. But I don't think it's possible to do what we do without some sacrifice to the needs of family and to our children growing up. I think there are things I could have done a little differently and maybe took a little edge off some of the things that I didn't do. But by and large, there is a price to pay. Nowhere for me is this price more fully illustrated than what happened with Dr. King and his family. Mm-hmm. I think his children paid a terrible price for what happened to both to Martin and to Coretta, and the constant fear and the constant absence that was evident in their lives. I think that had we done things a little differently, and could we have done things differently, the families might have fared better. But having said that, I'm hard-pressed to think of what it is we would have done differently. Mm-hmm. I don't think we'd have done very much.
When we come back, Harry Belafonte on his profound disappointment with the King Center today.
For this moment to have not been clearly a place of study that prepared young minds to continue the cause of the need of the struggle was for me a great loss. And once I saw that there was an entire board of people handpicked by the King family to just further their image and to further the cause of their power base, I just said, there's something wrong with this.
It's very interesting. When I tweeted this issue, I said I'm going to be interviewing Harry Belafonte. It was amazing how many people responded by saying, ask him how he really felt and how he feels today about being disinvited to speak at Coretta Scott King's funeral. Somebody who he supported her husband and his family. It's very interesting how many African Americans across this country were offended by that invitation being pulled.
The first thing I felt, beyond being stunned by the act itself, but I soon got off that. The first thing I looked at is, where did we fail? It's almost the same exact question that I asked Nelson Mandela. Where did we fail to pass off the baton? Where did the King family, where did Martin, Coretta, and the rest of us as the extended family fail in being able to protect and to care and to help guide those kids towards another level of social embrace, social activism that would have made them behave differently? And my great question was, how did the movement fail Dr. King and his family by not being there for those kids when they were molding and making up their ideas on what they wanted to do, when their time of maturity revealed itself? And I still wonder what we could have done differently to have them behave differently.
Are you sad to see the siblings fighting each other and being in court?
It's more than sad. I feel a deep sense of loss, and I feel somewhat responsible.
Just recently, MLK III, in essence, was removed as CEO of the King Center. They put his sister Bernice in as CEO. He then stepped down the following week as president. and he gave conflicting views. While reading your book, you talked about being on the board of the King Center when it was first established. And you basically said not only it didn't lose its way, it started off that way. And I always like to go back to when something goes wrong, can you go back to the beginning? Do you believe that that constant drama today is a result of it not having its firm roots established when it was started?
Absolutely no question about it. For me, what was clear with the way in which the board was being instructed and the way in which those who controlled the environment were headed was to not only idolize Dr. King, turn him into a deity, but was to create a temple of worship where they would constantly be at the center of the homage being paid. And I said, I don't think that's what Martin would have wanted. What I saw was clearly an institution of activism, rooted in the community, rooted in poverty. If you want to have a crypt where the poor access it very easily. Have instructions coming from the halls of reflection and analysis and study with scholars and whatnot that helps you continue the rebel cause, helps you continue the change that was meant to be by what Dr. King had done. I think it's all right to give dinner parties and black tie affairs and give awards for the lifetime achievement and all these titles that we put on things. But for this moment, to have not been clearly a place of study that prepared young minds to continue the cause of the need of the struggle was for me a great loss. And once I saw that there was an entire board of people handpicked by the King family to just further their image and to further the cause of their power base, I just said, there's something wrong with this.
Fidel Castro.
Fidel Castro, I thought he was a whiz. I saw in him a lot of heroics in the very beginning that was very, very attractive, because he was not the first great leader of a movement that had been called a terrorist or that was unacceptable to the status quo. Dr. King was a terrorist and a communist. So was Nelson Mandela, was a terrorist and a communist. And as a matter of fact, it wasn't until just about 3 years ago or so that America finally took Nelson Mandela off the terrorist list for the State Department as undesirables. So when I was a young man growing up and looking at all the rebellions that were taking place, Ho Chi Minh for the Asian people, Tom Mboya and Julius Nyerere and other people in Africa, and then you take a look at Michael Manley and people in the Caribbean, he was part of a time and of a global upheaval that I found very, very, very attractive. I'd gone to Cuba for a long time before Fidel Castro became involved. I had a lot of Cuban musicians, a lot of friends, hung out there with many a weekend with Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr. to have a weekend fling in Havana when we were working in Miami. So I had a long history with Cuba and Cuba's people. And when Fidel Castro stepped in, I was happy for us and for the Cubans. When it began to go adrift, like so much else went adrift within the communist order, we began to have a new set of concerns. I don't think communism in and of itself was what went wrong. What went wrong was another flaw in which the human race suffers from. Because the best that's even in America and in our Constitution was rooted in a certain kind of evil in its day. Because when I look at a Constitution that says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and you look at the minds that could create that phraseology that pushed an idea. And at the same time, these very same men were holders of slaves and cruelly subjected people to a second-class life of second-class citizenry. That was an evil, something villainous. And I think that what happened with communism, what happened with the leaders, power corrupted them and corrupted them to the point where they became totalitarian, they became so oppressive that they had to eventually implode, which is what happened. And I think Fidel Castro made a lot of mistakes, but I think in the beginning he was very heroic.
Up next, Harry Belafonte on his close friend, Dorothy Dandrich.
I don't think a black woman has ever paid as great a price for her blackness than did Dorothy Dandrich.
Red Tails movie came out a few weeks ago. Director George Lucas talked about going to the major studios in Hollywood and them saying, we don't know how to market a black film. So I'm reading my song and I'm reading you talk about Carmen Jones and Hollywood literally saying, man, it's an all-black cast. We don't know what to do with this film. How do you explain that? What do you say when even today Hollywood says, we don't know how to market nearly all black cast when 80% of the kids who buy hip hop are white, when some of the biggest entertainers in the world are African American? Is it an excuse?
It's not just an excuse. It's a cruel lie. What they're saying to you is, we do not think we're going to get as much money in return for our investment as we would get if we took that same investment and invested it in something that is mindless. What is the cost of mindlessness in your community worth to you, Mr. Studio, Mr. Banker? Because every time we have campaigned for a picture that is black, if you look in the long haul, it pays off. Carmen Jones was the biggest thing in its day. I can't say that Island in the Sun was quote unquote a black movie, but its theme had to do with black issues. And it was the big picture of its time and in its day.
Dorothy Dandrich.
I don't think a black woman has ever paid as great a price for her blackness than did Dorothy Dandrich, because the very thing that got her attention, which was her blackness, her inordinate beauty, and her talent, turned out to be the very thing that was her undoing, because there was not a system in place to take her on to the next logical extension of a successful career. She couldn't find enough leading men. You know, when it came time for her next movie, she had a choice of two people that could be with her constantly from a natural selective process, and that was either me or Sidney. And once she played us out, every other picture meant that she'd have to find new people. That meant she'd have to turn to Marlon and
right.
Clark Gable and Paul Newman, anybody else who was available. But Hollywood just wouldn't go that route. So when she lost a choice of leading men and leading women with which to play opposite, her turf ran barren. And I think that fact crushed her.
Something tells me in the book, though, that Harry Belafonte said, boy, if I could have been her lead man in private at home. Because it was so funny you writing about just that relationship there, when you were like, okay, this is how far is this going to go, doggone it.
If I wanted to be her leading man in private, I would have been her leading man in private.
But it was pretty funny to both.
Both she and I chose to have another style and to see life in another way. Yes, we were attracted to one another, but we didn't act on it because it was imprudent for she or I to have gotten involved romantically at that time in our lives.
Right. Harry Belafonte, it's always a pleasure.
Thank you, man.
I appreciate it.
It's a good shot.
Appreciate it. I hope you've enjoyed this interview with the legendary Harry Belafonte. I certainly know I did. I also loved his book, My Song, a memoir, and I recommend you download or pick up a copy. Also, we'll have more of the interview with Mr. Belafonte next week. I'm Roland Martin. Goodbye and have a blessed week.